Hey, Jam, guess what?
What?
Today is International Women in Science Day.
Nice.
Not the day that this comes out, the day that we're recording.
Got it. That was my next question.
Yeah.
Was like, did you look that far ahead and figure that out ahead of time?
No, not that on top of things.
Nice.
It's also Black History Month.
Yes.
Happy February.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a lot of things going on in the world of science funding, kind of behind the scenes a little bit of the current presidency and administration. And so I thought that this would be a good opportunity to do a little bit of a different episode and chat about some of these funding things that are happening and what some of the impact of them are on people at universities and science research.
Okay.
All right. Are you ready to do it?
Let's do it.
Great. Hey, I'm Melissa.
I'm Jam.
And I'm a chemist.
And I'm not.
And welcome to Chemistry for Your Life.
The podcast helps you understand the chemistry of your everyday life.
Okay. And if this is your first time listening, I think some important context about me is that I'm a chemist.
Mm-hmm.
A real one. I work as a chemistry instructor at the University of North Texas. I have my master's degree in organic chemistry, a PhD in chemistry education, and you
have that bachelor's degree. Remember?
I do have that somewhere too. Yes, and so I have spent time doing scientific research. I have contributed to the existing body of scientific research. And I have written grants for scientific research, and I've been paid by grants for scientific research. And I've worked in and around people at the higher level of education, in universities, either as a student or a graduate student or a TA or a faculty member or a postdoc since 2009, basically. And so I've had a lot of experience with research and how sort of like the academy, quote unquote, works. Mm-hmm. And so there's been a lot going on with some of the recent, I guess they're mostly done through, suddenly I'm blanking on the word, the presidential orders. What are those called?
Executive orders?
Executive orders. I couldn't think of those. A lot of it's been done through executive orders, which has made it even more confusing to kind of know what's actually happening.
Right.
But there are some impacts that we're already seeing. And I think that people don't know how broad reaching these impacts are, especially for people who aren't maybe like in the are you writing grant stage of things.
Right.
And so I just wanted to share some of what is going on, maybe a little bit behind the scenes or what people don't know about. One
thing that might be worth saying for posterity is that there's, of course, a chance that a lot of these won't last in terms of regardless of whether you like some of these executive orders or not.
Right.
The whole area of law that this is kind of gray.
Right.
So it might be possible if you're watching this several months later, maybe some of this has changed, and that might be great for science funding, which would be cool. So
yeah, that's true.
But in the moment, what Melissa's saying is, for someone like me, most of us are like, what is happening?
Right. Well, so are we actually.
Yeah, right. I guess we're all on a level playing field here. But especially if you don't really understand the science research funding side of things, which I only understand what we've talked about on this podcast before, if I remember it, that is. So there's a lot there that I don't understand. So this will be interesting to get into. Great.
Well, I'm kind of excited. I think it'll be maybe not fun, but I think it's important to talk about. And I'm glad that we have a space that we can talk about it. Mm-hmm. So, let's
just hope that no one's listening. We have a safe space where we can just talk about this and just be ourselves. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Well, I do want to start by saying, and I am going to circle back around to this at the end of why I do think DEI is important, but that's not the main thing I want to talk about today. Mm-hmm. So I'll start by saying a lot of the executive orders have been targeting specifically what is sort of being painted as unfair diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. Mm-hmm. I am going to take that and put it on a shelf and say that's what they're targeting. Okay. We'll talk about whether or not that helps academia or not at the end.
Mm-hmm.
But first, aside from that, I want to talk about all the other ways that this quote unquote DEI ban, that's what it's sort of being called, is like stopping this illegal DEI or unfair DEI, all the other things it's impacting that I don't think people know it's impacting.
Right.
And then I will circle back around at the end and talk about the importance of, or maybe even why we have some practices that are aiming to specifically include populations that are not represented well in science. But I'll talk about that at the end. I don't want that like buzzword to kind of get people to miss some of the big ideas that I don't think people know it all about. A lot of people, I think, have opinions about DEI initiatives, or IDEA is sometimes what it's called. Accessibility is the new A. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, I think. So people have a lot of opinions about that. So let's, for a moment, put that off to the side and say, because of this, a lot of other things are happening to science funding that people don't know about, and I think it's not really clearly communicated. And so that's what I want to talk about.
Okay, got it.
Okay, so, and I also think a little bit more background. So I'm a faculty member at a university in the chemistry department, and I have written grants for the National Science Foundation, and I have been paid on grants, not now, but in the past, for the National Science Foundation.
Okay.
And so I'm going to talk about this mostly from the National Science Foundation perspective, but other funding agencies are also being impacted. Okay. So the National Science Foundation is funded by the government. And there was a law passed in Congress that stated that in every grant, there must be included a broader impact. Okay. So, or like every grant that's awarded, I guess. So I'm actually going to read to you. This is from house.gov. This is from a U.S. code, right? uscode.house.gov. So this is law. The foundation, National Science Foundation, shall apply a broader impact review criterion to identify and demonstrate that projects support the following goals. So the National Science Foundation, just to say this another way, has to review every grant. Has to look at every grant that's applied, that they're asking for money, to see if it has a section that specifically discusses how this project is going to impact society as a whole.
Got it. Okay.
So you could have a science project on, for example, a chemistry podcast, which I have done, and I have to have a part of that includes specific details about how it's going to impact these following goals that I'm about to list. Or I could have a National Science Foundation project about something totally different, like think organic chemistry building new molecules, and you still have to talk about how is this going to help society as a whole. So no matter what grant, and the things that are typically included in that, the 7 things that are listed are increasing the economic competitiveness of the United States, advancing the health and welfare of the American public, supporting the national defense of the United States, enhancing partnerships between academia and industry in the United States, developing an American STEM workforce that is globally competitive through improved pre-kindergarten through 12 STEM education, teacher development, undergrad STEM education, improving public science literacy and engagement with science and technology in the United States, and expanding participation of women and individuals from underrepresented groups in STEM.
Okay.
So that last one, expanding participation of women and individuals from underrepresented groups in STEM, is often something that is included in broader impact statements. It's often something that is explicitly mentioned in National Science Foundation grants, whether or not they are projects about research related to diversity, equity, inclusion. They are mentioned. How are we going to work to expand participation of women and individuals from underrepresented groups in STEM in this project as part of our broader impacts, not just the science that we're doing, but how is this going to impact society? So every single grant that has been funded by the National Science Foundation since this like came to pass, no later than 6 months after January 1st, 2011 is when they started doing this. Every grant that has been funded in that time has had a broader impact section. Mm-hmm. And so that means that when the executive order that said that government had to cease payment on all government funding operations, pending a review of that, there's the language was unclear. First, it was all grant money, and then it was like grant money pending a review, and then it was like, well, not federal funding programs that impact people directly, and then there was a lawsuit immediately. So it's not super clear,
right?
And that goes to what you were saying, that this area of law is very gray.
Yeah.
And there is a really interesting article in Nature, which is a peer-reviewed journal, but this is more of like they did interviews with anonymous sources at the National Science Foundation, giving insight into like how crazy it's been, even for the people working at the National Science Foundation. Mm-hmm. But so what this has meant is that every grant that typically has some mention of broader impacts, which is often DEI related or like falls under the purview of DEI things, like words like advocacy, words like inclusion, like these things that may not even directly relate to some DEI initiatives are often in grants. Mm-hmm. And that means that a lot of people on those grants are not sure what's going to happen. And that might not seem like a big deal because you might be thinking like, oh, well, they're just not going to have money to like buy chemicals to do their research. But a lot of people are paid from those grants.
Right. That's what I was thinking. And I knew that, that was part of your, you were in a fully funded position in the past, right? Which meant that it was grant funded, correct?
Yes. Yeah. So my whole paycheck, all of my labor and man hours was paid for by the National Science Foundation.
Right.
And so, and I don't know that grant has mention, of course, because we're looking at education and it's important to see how does education impact all different populations. Mm-hmm. There's mention of different populations in STEM. And so that could have been a target, which I've talked to my old boss about this. And so far the messaging is keep going unless you're explicitly told to stop. But the NSF is saying that they're doing a review of all the grants that they have awarded.
Right. I see.
And so keep going until you're told to stop is not reassuring.
Yeah.
So that's a concern.
It's kind of like when you're like taking a timed test.
Yeah.
And you're thinking like, I think it's maybe about to be time. Mm-hmm. Like, are they just about to, say like 1 minute left or something like that? There's this feeling of like alarm and how many of these questions am I going to get to do? And what should I prioritize? And should I really start on this more difficult one? Or should I just go fill in all the bubbles with random stuff just to get more answers put in or something? Like that is the immediate feeling I thought of. It's like this, you don't know like how much time you have and how much harder that makes things feel.
Yeah.
Even if there's okay, we're not going to, stop anyone's job for at least a year or something like that. Mm-hmm. Even that would be helpful to be like, oh, okay. You're telling me I've got a year left. You're telling me I got,
right.
I still have 15 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
I can use that,
Yeah.
That wouldn't be great, but at least it'd be nice to, I don't know, not be completely in the dark.
Yeah. So that's scary.
Yeah.
But something that I think a lot of people know, like, oh yeah, some people get paid from grants. Not everybody knows you get paid, that there are people who get paid 100% from grants, but that does exist. Mm-hmm. But there's something else that a lot of people don't know is called indirect costs. And so essentially when I do research at a university, say like when I worked for Auburn, Auburn keeps the lights on. They keep the building running. They keep the building air conditioned. They keep the building clean. For organic chemists, they keep safety officers. They have employed people whose whole job it is to eliminate hazardous waste. They have like all these costs associated with research, and to sort of pay into those costs, every university typically will take, or any institution that oversees grants, I think, but definitely in universities, takes like about a third of the whole grant. So say you got like $1 million, $333,000 of that is going to the institution that's keeping your lab running. And that is a big income source to universities in the United States. And so that is a further source of concern is, okay, so we're freezing this funding, which might not directly impact someone like me, whose job is paid for by the university. But if we get budget cuts at the university level and they have to start potentially laying off faculty members, that's a thing that then could impact me. So that's a source of income to universities that I don't think people, I didn't know about it until I wrote grants. So I didn't know about it till I was done with my PhD and I was writing a grant for the first time as a postdoc. That's when I realized like, oh, I didn't know that, but I guess it makes sense, you know? So that's another thing is a lot of grants that probably have nothing to do with DEI are being frozen potentially as a result of, or potentially targeted as a result of this broader impact section that is required by law to be included, which is crazy. Some of the stuff that's coming out is like, oh, well, maybe we'll just have you alter that part of your grant. But, you know, there's so much gray that we don't know.
Right.
And then 2 is that there are a lot of people who get paid on those grants. And, you know, so we don't know how that's going to affect them. And then another is these indirect costs are going to impact not only scientists, but students at the undergraduate level. I think ultimately, if something doesn't change, if we stay where we are right now.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of other like little trickle down effects that I don't think people think about. Like, most students who are planning on graduating with their PhD in the next year are looking for postdocs currently. And a lot of those postdocs are funded off federal grants that have been awarded. And now we don't know if they'll be awarded or not. So a lot of those postdocs are then in this like hiring freeze. So I've had friends who are actively searching for jobs and have been like through several interviews and they think like, okay, I think I'm going to get this job. And then received an email after this announcement that they don't feel right about hiring because they have no idea what this situation is. So there's a lot of people, and that's happening in chemistry for sure, but I think it could be happening in other areas of science research as well, and even medical research, because the National Institute of Health is also, I think, in a similar situation. So that's something, every research professor, I think we've talked about this a little, but at universities, there's either teaching professors, basically, or research professors. So teaching professors are sometimes also called lecturers or professional faculty. So that's what I am. I'm a faculty member, but research isn't part of my job. I just wanted to teach and do this podcast. That's all I want. But there are others who research is part of their job, and they go into a really rigorous process called tenure, where they have to prove like over the course of the first like 5 or 6 years, are they really going to contribute to the university long term? And they have to prove that through getting grants and through writing papers and a bunch of other stuff. But with this current group of faculty members who have started probably in the last 5 years, they've first gone through COVID and now they're going through this. And so there are many of them who might not be able to get tenure in the way that you hope that their universities will make, accounts for this, but they might not. And so they're not looking competitive. And this is then, okay, so we've lived through one unprecedented time, and now the NSF has frozen its funding. I think that's having a big impact on faculty, especially younger faculty. And a lot of younger faculty, we'll talk about this a little bit more, is where a lot of underrepresented groups are because of historically certain groups not being allowed to participate in chemistry. And so that is going to have a big impact on a lot of people. And then, so that's something that I'm thinking of in terms of also students who are graduating from like undergrad degrees and looking into grad school. Well, often you don't get admitted into grad school unless the professors there are able to take more students into their lab. And if the professors aren't getting grants, they can't take students into their lab because they can't in good conscience know that they'll be able to pay for those students to work in their lab. And so then you don't get admitted into grad school. I mean, there's all these like little trickle downs of ways that this is going to impact people that I don't know that the broader public, like I don't even know if my students are aware that, hey, part of the university's bills are paid by grant overhead indirect costs, you know? So that's something that I think is important to think about. And then there's also, like I mentioned, the National Institute of Health, which would impact health specific research, cancer research, you know, medical care, like UNT Health Science Center or UT Southwestern. I know they are both a care granting institution and a research institution.
Yeah.
And so there's just a lot of impacts and a lot of things that are funded by federal grants in the scientific and even medical community that I just don't know how many people know. And so I just wanted to share like the impact that this is having on the scientific community, since we're a science podcast and we talk about things that we know because of scientific research. So I think that's important.
Yeah, I guess in that case, the one you just mentioned a second ago, it's at least it's good that we've already got, you know, cancer totally figured out. We like already have. So it's like, I guess it's like, there's a good point. It's like, why do we keep studying this stuff? You know? It's just like, it's to remove the sarcasm now. It's like, we need to do this. Like, why would we put any roadblocks in the way of those kinds of things? And I could see someone making an argument for wanting to review some stuff if they have some different opinions, or they're just concerned about a level of spending that maybe they feel is unsustainable. That's, I know people make cases about that, and that's worth talking about or whatever. But it does seem like just the grind a bunch of stuff to a halt, or at least create a bunch of confusion in areas where it's like, no, I really don't think you want to like cause that on a bunch of these things. Cancer's such a good example of that. It's like, we've been having tons of people trying to research this. There's so many kinds of cancer. There's different stages, there's different causes, different factors, different, you know, all this kinds of stuff. And it's like, this is something that I think probably broadly you could pull the average person on the street who would know someone or they themselves have experienced cancer and would be like, oh, no, I want them to like keep at that. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's I feel like a pretty good poster child maybe of a lot of people may feel like, I don't really understand about science funding. And then you're just like, well, have you ever heard of cancer?
Like, exactly.
There's people who are actively trying to research this in a bunch of places across our country that, you know, understandably need a lot of resources to do that.
Right.
And wouldn't it be great if they could keep doing that? And then you like, plus a lot of other things that are also really important that you maybe haven't heard of. But, you know, cancer is at least a decent, like, there's probably just not a lot of disagreement about that one. You know, I'd be so surprised if someone was like, let's stop that.
I think what's hard too is if it was like, okay, like kind of what you said, like, okay, no more money goes out. Like we've awarded what we've awarded. Let's stop here and reevaluate our budget. But it seems to be like retroactively affecting people who have been told like, okay, you get $1 million to cure cancer, right? And so you get $1 million to study this thing. And so you're like in the middle of trials. You have paid people to come and take this medicine. And then you're supposed to pay for them to be able to fly back. And you're supposed to be able to study them or whatever. And if you don't get paid from the government to pay them, and you don't get a lump sum of your $1 million, you know, you get like, okay, you're going to get $1 million over this many years.
Right.
And so each year you get so much money. And if it's like, nope, nobody gets their money this year, after we've been told that they're getting their money, the chaos that causes and the resources lost that people already spent and they might not be able to follow up on it, or the interruption of trials of like medical trials. There's just a lot of concerns. And I think what you said is a good point, is like, how much of this is really going to happen? Because what's an executive order when these have been funds awarded by Congress, you know, to the National Science Foundation, which then has the prerogative, you know, so it's definitely a gray area in terms of law, and I'm not a lawyer, so I have a lot of questions about that, but it's not, none of this is out of the question. All of these things are things that my colleagues and I are discussing, and we're concerned about the impact to individuals, individual research groups, individual institutions, and academia as a whole. Like we are like, oh, this is happening. So that is something that I thought was important to talk about. It's like,
and I think one of the things that it's causing that may shake out and become more clear in the coming months, that isn't right now, that is understandable, is like all of these different groups of people with this lack of clarity and this confusion of these executive orders out there. Maybe they won't stand, or maybe their language will get more, clarified at some point. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, most people are like, oh wait, hold on guys. I think we need to like pause stuff because we will end up needing to be compliant with whatever is determined to be the law.
Right.
And now that this is issued, we don't want to be breaking laws and make things harder for us or something like that, you know? So I feel like in all these different areas, there's people who their gut reaction, which is understandable, is like, okay, we're just going to pause a bunch of stuff until it's better understood. And so that it does cause an immediate effect.
Yeah.
Even if we clear it up soon, it's like, I totally get that for people who are like the decision makers or the, different lawmakers who are trying to sort it out. But in the meantime, they're like, wait, hold on, we have to actually pause.
Yeah.
Or we don't want to make this messier. And that makes it crazy.
And I think it can even have an impact. I think it very likely will have even an impact on the economy, right? Because it's like, there's all these people who are worried about losing their jobs or who now aren't spending the money that they were awarded, it's like that can impact a lot of things. And so, but I do think that right now, the biggest thing that it's caused is chaos, and uncertainty and confusion. And so, but also I realized that outside of my workplace, people don't really know that this is happening.
Right.
And so that was something I thought was important to share is like, okay, well, this might not seem like a big deal to you, but here's all the little ways that I have seen it impact. And then, so what I kind of wanted to then circle back around to is all of this is to target these DEI initiatives. And I wanted to talk about why those were in place and why that I think they're important, is because, there's really disproportionate numbers of people in our population in different demographics versus people in academia in different demographics. And I, went to school for chemistry in my undergrad class, and I didn't really feel like, oh, I'm part of an underrepresented population in this class. Like at the undergraduate level, actually women are overrepresented in science. But as you progress through the higher levels and you get from undergrad to grad and beyond, less and less of underrepresented populations are present. And so at my undergrad stage, I remember feeling like, I don't really think I'm underrepresented. But then when I got to grad school, someone literally said to me, I'm surprised that you're doing organic chemistry as a woman. Like they said that. And I was the only woman in the research organic division, at my school when I started.
Right.
Later on, another professor joined who was a woman and had women in her group, but in the research division, there weren't any other women. There was one female professor who taught organic chemistry, which then made me reflect and realize that when I was in my undergrad, I didn't have any female chemistry professors.
Wow.
And that was just in 2009, so, and I graduated in 2013. So, I think we see these dwindling numbers as we get into the higher, more elite positions. And there are statistics to back this up. So this is from a 2020 article from Chemistry and Engineering magazine. So this is a reputable source. It's put out by the American Chemical Society. And so they kind of take a look at the total population and then what percentage of that population has chemistry PhDs, and then what percent of that population are then professors at top 50 schools or even higher, more elite schools in that. And so just to take Black Americans, for example, the total population in the United States in 2018 of Black Americans was 13.4% of the population. The number of chemistry PhD recipients that were Black Americans were 4.5. And the number who were chemistry professors at top 50 schools in the 2017-2018 school year was 1.6%.
Okay, wow.
So 13% in the whole population, 1.6. And you might think, well, 2018, it's been almost 10 years. But in looking at the 10 previous years, those increased just 1% from, year to year, oftentimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes they go down. And so I want to talk about a little bit of why I think that is when it can be really hard to be one of the only people who looks like you or who has some of your identities in spaces like that. Like I was pointed out that it was weird that I was there because I was a woman. And I know that happens to other people from other populations. But also I think, the 1970s and 80s is when a lot of the people who are senior professors, and senior professors are the ones who make decisions about hiring. A lot of them got their PhDs in the 1970s and 1980s. So there are a lot of older professors got their degrees just 10 or 20 years after segregation ended. So if you think about that, it's like much of their schooling could have been in segregated spaces.
Right.
And much of the people raising them likely believed that segregation was okay, if not good. Right. And lots of rights for women weren't around until later on, so even the first Black woman who ever got a PhD was, we talked about this, a PhD in chemistry. We talked about this one year for Black History Month, was Marie Maynard Daly. And that was in 1947. And then I worked with people who got their PhDs in the 1970s, meaning, 20 or 30 years later, they got their PhD, one of probably very many people who looked like them, as opposed to like, okay, she was the first and only, and it's not like there was a huge like rush of then Black women getting their PhDs in chemistry after that.
Right.
And we'll even talk about an example in next week's episode that I already have planned of someone who was a woman who worked for the FDA, who did a lot of really wonderful things for the FDA. And she only got her job because her first name sounded like a man's name. And she got an acceptance letter to her graduate program addressed to Mr. And that faculty member was known to not hire women. So she was the first and was thought to be a man when she was hired.
Wow.
And I have worked with people who I have never known them to hire women in, the 10 years that I've known them. And I've talked to other people who've known them for longer, and they also haven't ever hired women. So it feels like, why do we have these DEI initiatives? Shouldn't it be based on merit? It's hard to make things based on merit when for a very long time, it was assumed that you couldn't have the merit because you are a woman or because you are a person of color. So merit-based systems are difficult to uphold in a society where it's like, well, for a really long time, if you looked like this, you were thought to not be capable. And some people who still hold positions of power were raised, like who decide who gets hired, for example, were raised in those environments. They might be carrying some of that either explicitly or implicitly forward. And that's sort of been what's shown to happen is when we say there are groups historically excluded from science, it's like you weren't allowed to do this if you were a woman, or you weren't allowed for a really long time to do this. And we're still seeing the effects in those numbers of the percentages of people who are making it to the elite levels of professors at top schools are not reflecting the same in our, global or our United States population. And so that's why a lot of those efforts are in place. And Congress even put out a call to action of we need to improve participation in STEM from these groups in the early 2000s. And so that was based in this data that was showing like, oh, there's something not right here.
Yeah.
It's not trying to exclude people who deserve it. It's trying to make sure that there's a way for people who deserve it, but have historically been told you're not allowed to be here.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about that too.
Yeah. And that's such a good distinction to make because I think it's just like one of those things where people have not really looked into it and it's misunderstood or misrepresented, then all takes a little bit of not describing something well, and someone's like, "Yeah, that doesn't sound like quite right to me." It's like, well, that's because that's actually not what it is, you know.
Right.
But it is hard when there's not a very good opportunity to understand something and ask questions about it, and see some data like that. That's like, hey, this doesn't seem quite right, you know. Like, there's this many people in the population of this either race or gender, and they're just kind of not ending up in these fields at all as time goes on, or just very, very little. Something might not be right here, you know?
Right.
And maybe it's very hard to get things to be perfect, but to see a huge gap there is like, okay, well, this seems like it could at least be better than this, right?
Right.
It's like something's not working here. But
yeah. And something that I learned, I took a class called Cultural Pluralism. And I ended up actually having to do a paper on like a specific demographic and their experience in my field. And what I found was a lot of interventions. So that's like things like, let me think about a better way to put that. As a professor, I can do certain things in my classroom to improve students' performance. They're called interventions. It's like, oh, this is a tool that's helpful to the students. So something like giving them an option for extra study groups, or, you know, interventions can take a whole lot of different things. One is even just like making sure that you draw in all the electrons on Lewis structures. It's like a small intervention, but it can impact students. You know, it's any step that you're taking to like help them learn, basically.
Yeah.
Those interventions that are put into place to broaden participation and improve performance for historically underrepresented groups, historically minoritized groups in science, they help everyone. They just disproportionately help the people who have been put at a disadvantage.
Right.
And so a lot of things I do in my classroom, I do because I learned about them in diversity, equity, and inclusion classes. And all my students benefit from them. And not all, but most of my students really appreciate them. Like, you know, nobody's perfect. I'm sure some of my students don't like it, but I've gotten so much positive feedback on things that I do specifically because I know that they're like targeted techniques to help people who they're like disproportionately help these groups of people, but I know that they're going to help every student in my classroom.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things like that we know because of research, but it helps everyone. We know because of projects that were supposed to broaden participation, but they don't just broaden participation or understanding of one group. They broaden participation and understanding of every group.
Right.
So they really benefit the whole population. And there's really clear research that diversity improves innovation, because if you have different ways of thinking about things, different experiences, you come at a problem from all these different angles, you know, it's not really great minds think alike. It's like the more different minds we have, the more opportunities we have to solve a problem. So that, I think those are some reasons that I think that these initiatives are really important. But aside from that, if you don't agree with that basic principle, there's also these other things that are happening that nobody's really talking about because the buzzwords are getting all the attention. And so I guess I just wanted to maybe like pull back the curtain and talk about some of the bigger impacts that these seemingly small changes are having in the name of DEI, but they're going to impact a lot more than just that. And I know a lot of our listeners, I don't want to scare anyone because we don't know what's going to happen. Yeah. But a lot of our listeners care a lot about science, and a lot of them are students or pursuing science education in some way. And so I just wanted to talk about like, oh, this is a good example of the people we vote for and the policies they put into place, not just at the nationwide level, but individual states and, you know, all your representatives. You know, Congress is the one who put this into place, right? So the more that you can work to put people in office who are going to uphold those values, that's going to help science, you know, in tangible ways. And so I just wanted to talk about some of that, the relationship between funding and academia and what's going on for me as a scientist and for a lot of my colleagues.
Yeah, that's helpful, especially because there are, like, me just seeing different headlines that I see. I can tell it's a broad reaching thing, you know, there's so many different areas that are are having their own level of confusion and chaos. But I haven't really had the version for specifically science research funding and teaching in colleges and all these different areas of it explained to me. So thanks for being willing to do that.
Yeah, thanks for being willing to listen. And if y'all have questions, I'm so happy to answer them. We can dedicate a Q&A or Q&R episode just to this if we get enough questions for it, because I definitely want to talk more. I think it's really important, and it's changing every day. So who knows, there might be something new by then. So keep your ears out.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Well, it's kind of hard to know how to end this. So I think I'll just wrap it up by saying that if you want to learn more, there's a really good article in Nature. It should be open access to anyone who wants it. It's called Exclusive: How NSF is Scouring Research Grants for Violations of Trump's Orders. And it's got, I think, 6 different anonymous sources from the National Science Foundation, and it'll give you even more insider information. It was a good read. And there's also Chemistry and Engineering News. The article that I referenced was Racial and Ethnic Diversity of U.S. Chemistry Faculty has changed little since 2011. So those are just some things for you to look at and hopefully grow your understanding. All right. Well, thanks, Jam.
Thanks for teaching us. Should we do our usual closeout
I think so. Yeah, let's do it.
If you'd like to, if you've got a question, a thought, an idea, something you're wondering about in the realm of, is this chemistry, something in my everyday life chemistry as usual, or in response to this episode or other episodes, a follow-up question, you can reach out to us on our website at chemforyourlife.com. That's chemforyourlife.com to share your thoughts, ideas, and questions. If you'd like to help us keep our show going and contribute to cover the costs of making it, you can do that by joining our super cool Chem community of patrons on patreon.com/chemforyourlife. That's patreon.com/chemforyourlife. You get some awesome perks and little things for us just to say thank you. You get an ad-free feed of the show. You get some behind-the-scenes kind of looks at how things go around here. You get some interaction with us and our community. It's a lot of fun, and it's just a way of us saying thank you and you keeping the show going and keeping it free for everybody else. And if you're not able to do that, though, you can still help us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app, rating and writing a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, subscribing on our YouTube channel. Those things also help us to share chemistry with even more people, help other people find the show and have the chemistry of their everyday life explained to them.
This episode of Chemistry for Your Life was created by me, Melissa Collini, and him, Jam Robinson. Jam Robinson is our producer, and as he said, this episode is made possible by our supporters on Patreon, and you all mean so much to us that we want to take a moment and shout you out each by name. So thank you to Chris and Claire S., Hunter R., Katrina B., Lynn S., Scott B., Stephen B., Tim P., who recently messaged making fun of me for saying nope every time I make mistakes. And reading the credits, shout out Tim. Brian K., Chelsea M., Dorian V., Elizabeth P., Heather R., John T., Jesse R., Latila, Rachel R., Autoclave, Avishai B., Chelsea B., Sierra L., Cullen R., Emerson W., Erica B., Jacob T., Jeanette N., Julie S., Christina G., Sarah M., Suzanne P., and Venus R. Thank you all so much for everything you do. Thank you for making chemistry for your life. Be sustained, and for your love of chemistry.
And those articles you mentioned earlier in our, are there links that we can share? Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
If you'd like to know more about today's, not chemistry lesson, but more of topic, then you can check out the references in our show notes or in the description of the video on YouTube.
Yay, chemistry!
Yay, chemistry!